The night had settled deep over the city, draping the streets in a heavy blanket of darkness. Streetlights flickered against the cold wind, their glow barely reaching the empty sidewalks. Inside a modest one-bedroom apartment, Daniel Hayes sat hunched over his laptop, the only source of light illuminating his tired face. He had spent the past few hours proofreading reports for his job, his mind numb from the monotony. Then, the phone rang. It was sharp, intrusive, a single chilling sound that shattered the silence. Daniel glanced at the clock. 1:13 a.m. A call at this hour was never good news. His stomach twisted as he reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. The number was unknown. For a moment, he hesitated. Common sense told him to ignore it. If it was important, they'd leave a message. But something about the stark emptiness of the screen, the lack of a caller ID, made his pulse quicken. Against his better judgment, he swiped the green icon and lifted the phone to his ear. Silence. Not the static-laced kind that came with bad reception. This was absolute, unnatural. No breathing, no ambient noise. Just an oppressive void on the other end. "Hello." Daniel's voice came out hoarse. Nothing. His skin prickled, an involuntary reaction to the deep, cavernous quiet. He pulled the phone away, checking the screen. The call was still connected. Someone was there, listening. "Who is this?" he asked, irritation creeping into his tone. A faint sound crackled through the speaker. A whisper. It was barely audible, like a breath pressed against his ear. Daniel froze. He swallowed hard, every muscle in his body rigid. "Look, if this is some kind of joke." Click. The line went dead. Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking off the lingering unease. Probably just a prank call. Kids messing around. He locked his phone and tossed it onto the couch. No big deal. But as he turned back to his laptop, the phone rang again. Daniel's breath hitched. He whipped his head around, staring at the glowing screen. Same number. A cold bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He let it ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. By the 5th ring, the sound was unbearable. His fingers twitched toward the phone, compelled by some unseen force. His rational mind screamed at him to let it go, to block the number, to not answer. And yet, he did. Again, silence. Daniel gritted his teeth. "Listen, I don't know who you are, but if you call again, I'm reporting this to the police." This time, there was no whisper. But there was a sound. Faint. In the background. A soft, deliberate tap. 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 Daniel's brows furrowed. He turned his head slightly, listening harder. It almost sounded like. His eyes darted to the front door. The tapping wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from inside his apartment. Daniel's blood ran cold. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. His gaze flicked toward the hallway leading to his front door. The tapping had stopped. He forced himself to take a step forward, heart hammering against his ribs. His pulse roared in his ears as he peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway outside his apartment. A sharp inhale. His fingers tightened around the phone. He turned back toward his living room, scanning every shadowy corner. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the air felt wrong. The phone buzzed against his palm. A text. His stomach twisted as he glanced at the screen. The message was simple. "Let me in." Daniel's breath hitched. His mind raced. Someone was outside. Someone knew he was awake. The room felt suddenly suffocating, the walls pressing inward. His hand trembled as he typed a response. "Who are you?" A few seconds passed. Then another message. "I saw you through the peephole." A sharp, nauseating dread twisted inside him. He whipped around, looking back at the door. A surge of cold fear crawled up his spine. He hadn't seen anyone. And yet, they had seen him. Daniel staggered backward, his breath coming in short gasps. He forced himself to think. This had to be a joke. Maybe one of his friends messing with him. But deep down he knew. He was alone. The phone rang again. Daniel's shaking fingers hovered over the screen. He didn't want to answer. He shouldn't answer. But he did. This time, the whisper was clearer. A voice, just barely above a breath. "You shouldn't have picked up." The call cut out. A new message appeared instantly. "I'm already inside." A sharp, suffocating silence filled the room. Daniel turned slowly, his body rigid with dread. The apartment was dimly lit, casting thick, stretching shadows along the walls. Then he saw it. A figure, tall, impossibly still, standing in the dark corner of his living room. A single thought pounded in his head as his vision blurred with fear. He had left his door locked. Hadn't he? Daniel's entire body locked up as his gaze remained fixed on the figure lurking in the corner of his living room. It stood unnaturally still, blending into the shadows, yet unmistakably there. Tall, motionless, watching. His breath hitched. He wanted to move, to run, but fear clamped down on his muscles, paralyzing him. His mind screamed for him to do something, yet all he could do was stare into the black void where a face should have been. The apartment felt unbearably quiet. Then the figure twitched. Not a step, not a shift, just the faintest, unnatural jerk, as if someone had rewound time by a single frame. Daniel's stomach twisted into knots. He took a slow, shuddering breath. Maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. Maybe it was just a shadow from the dim lighting. But then, the silence shattered. His phone vibrated in his hand. Another text. He didn't want to look. He shouldn't look. But his fingers moved on their own, his gaze flicking down to the screen. "Don't turn your back." Daniel's breath stopped. His pulse pounded so violently he thought his ribs might crack under the pressure. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. This isn't real. It can't be real. But the figure remained, unmoving. His fingers trembled around the phone. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand here. Slowly, painstakingly, he reached for the nearest lamp. His hand hovered over the switch. One flick. That's all it would take. The light would drive away the shadows. Reveal nothing was there. He took a breath and turned it on. The lamp bathed the room in a warm, golden glow. And just like that, the figure was gone. The corner was empty. Daniel's chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. He exhaled shakily, pressing a hand to his forehead. Jesus Christ! It had to have been his imagination. The exhaustion. The eerie late-night phone calls. His mind was just playing tricks on him. He let out a bitter laugh, rubbing his eyes. "Get a grip, man," he muttered to himself. His phone vibrated again. Another text. His heart clenched. Turning on the light won't help. Daniel's stomach dropped. His fingers stiffened around the phone. No. No, no, no. A chill slithered down his spine. His eyes darted around the room. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to leave, now. But then, something even worse happened. The overhead light in his hallway flicked off. Darkness swallowed the entrance to his bedroom. Daniel barely had time to process the implications before another tap, tap, tap echoed from inside his apartment. It came from his bedroom. He wasn't alone. Panic surged through him like wildfire. He needed to get out. His keys. Where were his damn keys? He scrambled to the coffee table, knocking over a glass of water in his haste. His trembling fingers clutched the metal keyring as his mind reeled. His apartment door was only a few feet away. He could make it. Then, his phone rang. Loud. Shrill. Piercing through the suffocating silence. Daniel flinched, nearly dropping the keys. He glanced at the screen. Unknown caller. No. No, no, no. A tight knot of dread curled in his gut. The ringing continued, persistent, mocking. Daniel's shaking finger hovered over the decline button. But before he could press it, the ringing stopped. A new message appeared. "You're making this worse." Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps. He gritted his teeth, willing himself to not look toward his bedroom. But something inside him, something beyond logic, forced his gaze toward the open doorway. A face stared back at him. It wasn't human. It was just too dark. An abyss where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should be. Like a void carved into the shape of a person. Daniel choked on a breath. His entire body recoiled in horror. His brain screamed at him to move, run, get the hell out. The figure tilted its head. A slow, deliberate motion. Observing him. Then it moved. Fast. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He lunged for the front door, fumbling with the keys. His hands were slick with sweat, shaking so badly he couldn't fit the key into the lock. The footsteps rushed toward him. Daniel slammed his body against the door, throwing all his weight into turning the knob. It wouldn't budge. His own damn lock. He was trapped. The air behind him grew heavy, wrong. He could feel it. The presence. Right there. His phone buzzed. Another message. He didn't want to look. But he did. "I'm right behind you." Daniel's stomach clenched violently. His breath hitched. Then, he felt it. A whisper of cold air against the nape of his neck. Something too close. Too real. A single breath. Not his. Daniel screamed. The lights flickered violently, bulbs bursting in sharp, crackling pops, plunging everything into suffocating darkness. Silence. Then, a click. The front door swung open. The front door swung open as if something, or someone, had unlatched it from the other side. Daniel didn't hesitate. He bolted. His feet barely touched the floor as he sprinted into the hallway, his breath ragged, pulse hammering against his ribs. The door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the walls, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He tore down the dimly lit corridor of his apartment building, his only thought, get out. Get out now. His fingers fumbled for his phone as he ran. He needed to call someone. Anyone. The police? A neighbor? Someone had to know what was happening. But as soon as he unlocked the screen, his stomach turned to ice. No signal. Not just low reception. 0 bars. His breathing quickened. He kept moving, nearly tripping over his own feet as he reached the building's stairwell. His apartment was on the 5th floor, but waiting for the elevator felt like a death sentence. He took the stairs 2 at a time, each step echoing unnaturally around him. Then, his phone buzzed. Daniel's breath hitched mid-step. Another message. "Why are you running?" His heart stopped. He came to an abrupt halt on the 3rd-floor landing, gripping the railing for support. His hands were shaking so hard he nearly dropped the phone. This wasn't possible. His apartment was empty. He saw no one. Who was sending these messages? The air in the stairwell felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, but his legs refused to cooperate. Then, a sound. A soft, distant hiss. Like white noise. Static. It was faint at first, barely a whisper in the silence. But then it grew, swelling into a low, distorted buzz that made his skin crawl. Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the next flight of stairs. And that's when he saw it. A figure stood on the floor below. Not moving. Not breathing. Just standing there. Its shape was all wrong. Too tall, too thin. Limbs stretched beyond normal proportions. A void where a face should be. The static grew louder. Daniel's fingers clenched around the phone, sweat slicking his grip. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The figure twitched. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The static pulsed. Then, the lights flickered. Darkness swallowed the stairwell for half a second. When the lights came back, the figure was closer. 1 floor closer. Daniel's body locked up. His muscles screamed at him to move, to run, but terror pinned him in place. Another flicker. Closer. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the static. The lights flickered again. And this time, the figure was right there. A breath away. Daniel launched himself up the stairs, his body moving before his mind could catch up. His legs burned, his lungs screamed, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The static was everywhere now, blaring in his ears. He reached the lobby door and shoved it open. The moment he stepped into the open space, everything went silent. No static. No footsteps. Nothing. Just the low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a city that felt a world away. Daniel stumbled forward, gasping for breath. The lobby was empty. The front desk, usually manned by a security guard, was abandoned. His body trembled as he reached for his phone again, praying for a signal. 1 bar. He exhaled sharply, quickly dialing 911. The call rang once, twice. Then, a click. Silence. Daniel's throat tightened. Hello. A faint hiss crackled through the speaker. Then, a voice. Low. Distorted. Wrong. You shouldn't have answered. Daniel's blood turned to ice. A sharp burst of static rang through the phone, forcing him to yank it away from his ear. He winced, his pulse hammering. Then, just as suddenly, the line went dead. The screen displayed 2 words that made his stomach churn. Call ended. His breath hitched. No. No, no, no. His shaking fingers redialed. No signal. His body felt frozen in place. Trapped. The silence of the lobby pressed against his eardrums, thick and suffocating. Then, the elevator doors dinged. Daniel's head snapped toward them. He hadn't called for the elevator. His stomach clenched as the doors slowly slid open. Inside, darkness. No lights. No interior glow. Just pitch black. Daniel's breath came in short, ragged gasps. Then, deep inside that inky abyss, something shifted. A shape. A shadow. It was in the elevator. Watching him. His phone buzzed. His trembling gaze dropped to the screen. One new message. His vision blurred with fear as he read the words. It's waiting. The static returned. A slow, building hum that made his skin prickle. Then, the lights in the lobby flickered. Daniel took a step back. The elevator doors started to close. His mind screamed not to watch, not to look. But as the gap between the doors narrowed, he saw it. Just before the darkness swallowed the figure whole. It smiled. The doors slid shut, sealing the figure inside the elevator. But the moment before they fully closed, that smile. It wasn't human. It wasn't just a curve of lips or a movement of skin. It was wrong, stretched too wide, teeth too sharp, like the idea of a smile rather than a real one. Daniel stood frozen, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. His phone buzzed. His body lurched as he tore his gaze from the elevator and looked at the screen. One new message. His stomach twisted. Every instinct told him not to look. But he did. You saw me. Daniel's breath hitched. His fingers clenched around the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. The air in the lobby felt thicker now, pressing against his skin like invisible hands. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, their glow oddly dim, as if something unseen was draining the life out of them. He took a slow, shaky step back toward the main entrance. The glass doors stood only a few feet away, the city beyond looking impossibly distant, as though he were staring at it through a tunnel. Daniel's fingers brushed against the handle. Then the lights went out. Darkness. Complete. Smothering. Alive. His breath caught in his throat. He couldn't see. Not even his own hands in front of his face. A sharp, static-laced whisper sliced through the silence. Don't run. Daniel's stomach dropped. It was close. Right behind him. Panic surged through his veins. His muscles screamed at him to move, but terror locked him in place. Then, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. A soft scrape against the tile floor. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. This isn't real. It isn't real. Another step. The whisper twisted through the dark, no longer a voice, but a sound, a crackling, warping, unnatural distortion. Then, in the blackness, something brushed against his arm. Daniel snapped. His body moved before his mind could catch up, and he lunged forward. His hands fumbled blindly for the door handle, and by some miracle, his fingers found it. He yanked. The door wouldn't budge. Locked. His pulse roared in his ears. His breaths came in ragged gasps. Then, the footsteps stopped. Silence. A presence loomed behind him. A voice, soft and wrong, whispered against his ear. "Don't you remember?" Daniel's entire body went cold. The words did something to his mind, like a hook sinking into the back of his skull and pulling. A flood of images burst behind his eyes. A room. Dimly lit. Walls lined with screens, static hissing from them like 1,000 whispers. A single, black telephone sitting on a desk. The receiver off the hook. A voice on the other end, distorted, calling his name over and over. Daniel gasped, shoving the images away. No, this wasn't real. He slammed a fist against the door in frustration. Then, the lights flickered back on. Daniel whirled around. The lobby was empty. No shadows. No whispering voices. No figure. His breath came in quick, uneven bursts as his gaze darted around, expecting something to be lurking. Then, his phone vibrated. He hesitated before looking down. One new message. Hands shaking, he opened it. "You can't run from this." Daniel swallowed hard. A wave of nausea rolled over him. His legs felt weak, like they might give out any second. The memories. They didn't make sense. He didn't remember any of that, did he? A shudder crawled down his spine. He had to get out. Without wasting another second, Daniel bolted for the stairwell. The streets, the subway, anywhere was better than here. But just as he reached for the stairwell door, his phone rang. The sound pierced the silence, high-pitched and shrill. His fingers trembled over the door handle. He didn't want to answer. He couldn't. But the ringing wouldn't stop. Over and over and over. He turned the phone over in his hand, his vision blurring from terror. Unknown caller. Daniel clenched his jaw. If he answered, he knew it would change everything. But somehow, he also knew he had no choice. With a shaky breath, he pressed his thumb to the screen. And answered. The call connected. For a moment, silence. Then, the static returned. Soft at first. Growing. Consuming. And within that static, his own voice spoke back. "Why did you leave me?" Daniel's entire body froze. His grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. That voice was his own. The call cut out. Daniel stood there, shaking. His mind spun, his pulse pounded, his breath hitched. Then, slowly, his phone buzzed one last time. A final message appeared on the screen. He didn't want to read it. He already knew what it would say. Still, he looked. "Come home." The static grew louder. Daniel's vision blurred. And then, everything went black. Everything was dark. Not just the absence of light, but something deeper, a hollow, consuming void. Daniel's body felt weightless, as though he were drifting in a place without gravity, without direction. A thick, distant ringing filled his ears, like the echo of a phone call from miles away. Then, a flicker. A faint, pulsing glow somewhere ahead. It wasn't light. Not really. It was something else, something wrong. And deep inside, Daniel knew exactly where he was. The room. He couldn't explain how he knew. He couldn't remember how he had arrived. But this place was familiar. He stood in the center of a small, windowless chamber, bathed in the eerie glow of old, buzzing television screens stacked along the walls. Each one flickered with static, the shifting black and white patterns almost alive. In front of him, at the very center of the room, sat a single black telephone. Old-fashioned. Heavy. Its rotary dial was motionless. The receiver was off the hook. And yet, the dial tone hummed softly, as if waiting. Daniel's breath came in slow, shaky bursts. Everything in his mind screamed at him to turn around, to run, to wake up. But he didn't. Because something inside him already knew. He had been here before. The memories came in flashes. Sitting in this very room. The television screens displaying faces. His face, morphing, distorting. The phone ringing, over and over, never stopping. A voice whispering from the receiver, calling his name in his own voice. This wasn't a nightmare. This was a memory. His fingers trembled as he stepped forward. The phone sat before him, humming with an energy he could feel in his bones. As if it were waiting for him. His breath hitched as a voice, his own voice, whispered from the receiver. You left me. Daniel's entire body went cold. The screens around him flickered violently. The static shifted, forming shapes, shadows. They stretched and twisted, pulling at the edges of reality, distorting the walls, the floor, the very air. The voice from the phone grew louder. You don't remember, do you? Daniel swallowed hard.
No.
He didn't. He didn't want to. A deep, suffocating dread clawed at his chest. His hand shook as he reached out, fingers hovering just above the receiver. The second he touched it, everything snapped into place. The truth. It hit him like a shock wave. Years ago, Daniel had answered a call. A wrong number. A voice, just like his own, had whispered from the other end. It had asked him a simple question. Do you want to leave? And he had said yes. That was the moment he had been split. A part of him had remained trapped in this room, answering the endless ringing of the silent caller. The other part? The Daniel who had lived his life in the real world? He had been nothing more than a fragment, a copy, a hollow echo of himself. But the truth was unavoidable now. Daniel had never escaped. Because Daniel had never been real. The real Daniel had never left this room. He was still here. The voice on the other end of the receiver, asterisk asterisk his real voice, spoke again. Soft. Certain. It's time to come back. Daniel's breath hitched. The screens around him shattered. The static roared. The phone's hum grew into a deafening, pulsating screech. His vision blurred. His body felt like it was unraveling. And then, silence. The apartment. The phone on Daniel's nightstand rang. A sharp, shrill sound cutting through the quiet room. The man lying in bed, Daniel, stirred awake. His eyes fluttered open, confusion settling in as he reached for the ringing phone. He frowned. The screen read unknown caller. Something inside him twisted. A deep, gnawing sense of déjà vu. His fingers hovered over the screen. Then, hesitantly, he answered. Hello. Silence. Then, a familiar voice spoke back. His own voice. Did you forget me again? Daniel's breath hitched. And then, the call cut out. The room was silent once more. But something was different. Something was missing. Daniel sat up, suddenly feeling cold. Like a part of himself had just vanished. And outside, beyond the walls of his apartment, beyond the veil of reality itself, somewhere far away, a phone began to ring again, waiting for the next answer.